Good evening and welcome. My name is Dennis Jacobs. I serve as Fordham's Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs. And on this, the eve of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, it's my pleasure to welcome each of you here to a very special observance, remembering, talking about the Holocaust in the 21st century. I want to extend a warm welcome to the many hundred who are joining us by live stream, and certainly all of you who've made the trip here to Fordham. Tonight's discussion will delve into the conditions that allowed for the ripening and spread of anti-Semitism leading up to the Holocaust, and examine the relevance of those circumstances today. Fordham University is pleased to be hosting tonight's event. We are the home of the Center for Jewish Studies, which nurtures a vibrant community of scholars to engage in discussion and dialogue across disciplines and with the wider public. Also, Fordham is pleased to be the place for the Rosenblatt Holocaust Collection, one of the strongest Holocaust collections in the country with over 10,000 titles. Fordham is currently hosting an exhibit confronting hate, anti-Semitism, racism, and the resistance on our Rose Hill campus in the Bronx. I'm grateful to Fred DeSam Lazaro, correspondent and director of the Undertold Stories Project at the University of St. Thomas, for being really the impetus for tonight's event. The mission of the Undertold Stories Project is to explore pressing issues of our time using storytelling to enhance learning about them in the classroom and beyond. It reaches millions of viewers through its partnership with PBS NewsHour, as well as through collaborations with educators and students. We're deeply grateful tonight for our partners in this event, the Museum of Jewish History, a living memorial to the Holocaust, Exploring Hate, Anti-Semitism, Racism, and Extremism, a public media initiative from WNET here in New York, Fordham University's Center for Jewish Studies, PBS NewsHour, and the University of St. Thomas. I also want to acknowledge the generous donors who've made this event possible. The Indian Trail Foundation, Wallace Foundation, and the Exploring Hate Initiative at WNET. And finally, my gratitude to an extraordinary team here on the ground that has helped make this event possible. Our own Professor Magda Teter, who will be one of the panelists up here shortly, Liz Davis, Liz Manigan, and the Fordham University events team, Bob Howe from Communications, the IT team here in Gabelli that is helping to live stream this event, and finally, Rose Vondrasek out of the University Provost's office, who's really pulled together and done a lot of the coordinating and communication in a really complex planning effort to make this all possible. We're obviously very grateful for the Undertold Stories Project, especially Fred DeSam Lazaro and Simeon Lancaster for your close partnership. I hope you'll all feel free to join us after this event. As the panel wraps up, we're going to have a reception out here in the Platt Atrium to continue the discussion. We're thrilled to offer a kosher menu created by David Tafe, executive chef at Madison and Park Hospitality Group, who owns the Locks Cafe at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, as well as the Greenwich and Delancey restaurant in Coast Cobb, Connecticut. Special thanks to Anthony Davidson for helping to organize the coordination of tonight's catering. To moderate tonight's panel, Fred will be joined by Peter Osnos, renowned journalist, editor, and publisher. Welcome, Peter. After the discussion, the panelists are happy to respond to some of your questions. And so we've offered you index cards when you came in, and we'd invite you to write a question that you might have on those cards and then just pass it down to the aisle. If you leave it on the stairs in the aisle, someone will step by and pick it up tonight, and we'll try to answer as many questions from the audience as we are able. To get our program started tonight, I'd like to introduce Rob Vischer, president of St. Thomas University, who will be joining us by video. Rob?
Good evening. Good evening. I'm Rob Vischer, the president of the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. We are proud to be the home of the Undertold Stories Project. In partnership with the PBS NewsHour, the project has reported from 70 countries, bringing to our audience, especially our students, storytelling on some of the world's most pressing issues. Today's event, commemorating the Holocaust, is no exception. It could not be timelier for all the reasons you will soon hear discussed. We are proud to partner with Fordham University and the Museum of Jewish Heritage tonight. Warm wishes, and I'll hand it over to Fred.
From the victims of forgotten wars to the daily crises rooted in inequity.
I miss school. I miss work at school.
Our undertold stories shed light on issues that risk being overlooked amid the breathless news cycles.
Our call should become an SOS call for the bigger world out there. It's because of their activities that we suffer for no fault of ours.
Whether climate and environment, water, sanitation,
my children get sick because of the water,
food security, or global health,
there was no food for us in the house.
our stories explore entrenched social challenges and the agents for change working to meet them.
I decided to change the pain I had gone through into something beautiful, something that will help me reach out to other women.
We're in the same boat, and we're either going to float together and sail that boat literally down the Jordan, or we're going to sink here at the Sea of Galilee.
These stories keep critical issues in the public eye, and last year that mission turned our attention to this story.
People across Europe, Israel, and the world are preparing to observe International Holocaust Remembrance Day tomorrow, commemorating the millions of European Jews killed by Nazi Germany. The day was created in 2005 by the United Nations to sustain public awareness of the genocide, which studies show has rapidly declined in recent years. Special correspondent Fred DeSam Lazaro shows us one creative attempt to educate younger generations. His story is part of our Arts and Culture series, Canvas.
The pen and ink drawings are his trademark, intricate, layered with meaning in thousands of dots. Dots children's book author Peter Cease wants his readers to connect.
I have almost like a third language when between the minimal text and the picture I can load in some symbols and things which maybe will make you open the door or try to think about something else.
His books have a wide demographic target, young readers to teens. Many are profiles of heroic figures in history.
Galileo Galilei, who doesn't give up, and he's a genius. And it was like, the idea was like, children among you, one of you can be Galileo Galilei.
So this is my awards storage place.
He's won scores of awards, including the so-called MacArthur Genius, for books that include The Wall, about his own coming of age behind the Iron Curtain. His latest, Nikki and Vera, tackles a darker subject, the Holocaust, and a quiet hero, Nicholas Winton, who saved 669 mostly Jewish children from almost certain death.
As a young man, Nicky traveled all over Europe.
The idea came to Cease in Europe in 2009 on a visit to his native Prague, where a group of those children were retracing their long-ago train journey to England. A celebration was planned there for Winton's 100th birthday.
It's wonderful that it did work out so well, because after all, history could have made it very different.
Winton was a stockbroker in London when he heard of disturbing developments in Czechoslovakia, which had come under German occupation in the months leading up to World War II. He went to Prague hoping to evacuate children whose parents were willing to let them go to England for what they hoped would be temporary safe haven.
So he himself immediately sets up a little office, writes the lists of the children, and manages to get trains, visas, places in England they would stay with foster families.
Urgency drove creativity. Sometimes Winton faked documents or bribed Gestapo officials, doing whatever it took to get as many children out quickly before war would shutter borders.
If I bribe the train people, they will give me train. If I bribe the Gestapo person, he will be looking the other side. So I appreciate that he was creative in this terrible situation.
Winton's effort was not the only so-called Kindertransport or child rescue program in the period leading up to World War II. What's different here is that once done, he just went on with life and didn't tell a soul about it.
He helped open a school, he got married, he found an old people's home. He never told anyone about the children.
Until nearly 50 years later, when Winton's wife Gretchen found his scrapbook in their attic and passed it on to researchers who tracked down some of his children.
And all of a sudden they are old.
That led to a meeting on a BBC broadcast.
Can I ask, is there anyone in our audience tonight who owes their life to Nicholas Winton? If so, could you stand up, please?
And it was this video that drew Cease to one of those children, Vera Gissing, and Nicky and Vera began to take shape.
Vera was the queen of cats.
Cease illustrated Vera's idyllic life before the war, people and things she would leave behind, her parents, grandparents, her horse, and of course her cats. But Vera's mother feared the Nazis and joined hundreds of desperate parents in lines outside Winton's office in the Prague Hotel. Cease draws this in muted black, white, and blue.
He took their photographs. He found train connections, spice-kept watch.
3 days before her 11th birthday, Vera boarded a train with 76 other children, including her sister. For almost all, it would be the last time they saw their parents.
Little Vera finds family which is very poor, but the husband says, I cannot beat Hitler, but I can at least help one child who will survive this whole time.
My biggest takeaway is how incredibly fortunate we were.
87-year-old Eva Paddock was just 3 when she boarded the last of Winton's trains.
First of all, that my mother would allow us to go. Giving up a child or children is amazingly difficult. Stops me right there even now.
Paddock was one of very few children whose parents survived the war and reunited with her in England. She moved to the U.S. and a career in education and later mental health care. She has no worries that Cease's book is too dark for young children.
Every child has understood being left out of a group, being meanly treated. To me, the book, and when I talk about it, is really a message of altruism, actually.
The book is filled with illustrations that she says encourage readers to dig deeper, even at older ages.
Children will ask questions, and then you go in their direction and in as much depth as they can. But the story, simply can't die, and it's going to die unless we start with children.
Nicholas Winton died in 2015, aged 106. Vera Gissing, whose own memoirs informed so much of Cease's book, suffers advanced dementia. She's 94. I reached her daughter, Nicola Gissing, in Bristol, England.
I think on some kind of deeper level, she realises that there's something about her and something's being made and her story is still being told.
A story both she and Peter Cease say is very relevant today, a time when millions of children find themselves in migrant journeys in search of safe haven.
I realized these are all human beings who have dreams, how impossible it is for the parents. What parent would even put the children on the train or tell the children, go, you have to go now, this is the only solution to survive. All of a sudden, all these children who were crossing the borders, who were trying to live somewhere else, who were immigrants like me, it all connected.
Nicky and Vera has been translated into Italian, Chinese, Korean, and starting on this International Holocaust Remembrance Day, it is available in German. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Fred DeSam Lazaro in Irvington, New York.
It just grabs your heart. And Fred's reporting is in partnership with the Undertold Stories Project at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize some people with us before we get rolling. First of all, Peter Cease, are you here? A copy of Nikki and Vera is on the display case outside alongside other published works of all of our panelists. Also, one of our supporters of this event is Patty Kenner, no stranger to the fight against anti-Semitism, and she's brought with her, or invited, one of the children who was on a Winton train, Hannah Sloan, who joins us. Hannah will be turning 99 in April. I'd also like to thank our Undertold Stories Project Advisory Board. This is the project that makes possible stories like the one that you saw, and I'm deeply grateful to my advisory board members who've made the journey to New York from all parts of the country. Others are online, but Linda Heschler, Stephen Ussery, Carol Heen, here from Minnesota, Charles Eisenbrath from Ann Arbor, Brenda Wilson from Washington, D.C., and Bill Baker from Connecticut, but more immediately the 11th floor of the building next door here in Fordham. Thank you all for being here. I'd like now to invite to the stage another one of Nicky Winton's children, who you saw briefly introduced in the piece. Ladies and gentlemen, Eva Paddock. Who lives now in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Grew up, I'll throw out a little bit of biographical background. One of the biggest challenges I do is I have a lot of that needs to be crammed into not a lot of time. And this is a book sitting here that we could not write or tell about. But Eva has spent all her life in a varied career as a school teacher, as a school principal, as a mental health counselor, and she facilitates for a group of child survivors of the Holocaust. Thanks for making the trip down here, Eva.
My pleasure.
Indeed. You were among a handful of children on Nicholas Winton's trains who managed to reunite with your parents.
We start again.
Eva was one of very few children who survived, or whose parents survived, and with whom you were reunited in 1940. You were still very young and don't have your own vivid memories, but talk about what memories have been recovered, your recollections of what you were told. Share a little bit about what you've learned about your reunion with your mother.
I was very young, so I don't remember a lot, and much of what I remember is anecdotal from other people. But I did learn, or heard, that when my mother arrived in 1940, she got out in a very unusual way after war had begun, that I didn't speak Czech anymore, which, as anyone who knows anything about children, at 3 1/2, you have not lost your primary language. So clearly that was a traumatic response. We had gone to a foster family, a wonderful, wonderful couple in Lancashire. And of course, I, at 3 1/2, had bonded with that family and was none too pleased with a mother who apparently had sent me on a train and now she'd appeared. That healed itself, of course, but that was certainly an early childhood experience. And what I remember mostly is the wonderful, loving family that we were very, very fortunate to be taken in by. And as I often say, they took us in with no sell-by date. They took in two refugee children, and they could have been stuck with us for the rest of our lives. Nobody at all thought that our parents would ever appear.
Growing up, you say your family was not particularly observant, but tell us a little bit about what your parents told you about things like anti-Semitism, about the Holocaust. What lessons do you think they were trying to instill in you as you were being raised?
There was no conversation in our home about what had been. There was no conversation about victimhood. It was all about gratitude, how wonderful the British people were, and about the wonderful things that people had done to get us to safety. There was never any talk about what was lost, what was left. My mother, who was a physician, was a kind person. The only time I, in my later years, heard her be in the slightest bit cross was with her friends who couldn't leave because they wouldn't leave their silverware and they wouldn't leave their home. She had very little patience of that because she left with one trunk and nothing else mattered.
So it was all about altruism.
It was all about altruism.
You talk about your father's escape. Give us a little bit of your father's backstory because it's fascinating.
Well, one of the reasons, the reason that I was put on the kinder transport, which was a train for children who were at great risk, those were the children that Nikki was trying to help escape, was certainly that I was Jewish, but we were like many Central European intellectual families. We were not practicing Jews, intellectual family. My father, as a young man, had become a politician in a very, very small village called Prosech that we lived in. And there was a little cadre of young people in their 20s, very interested in literature, music, poetry. And he was one of a group who was very, very interested in Thomas Mann. And he knew that Thomas Mann was at that time stateless and living in Switzerland with no passport. Hitler had been burning his books. And my father, who had what everybody knows as chutzpah, thought, gee, Thomas Mann's a wonderful man. I know he's there with stateless, no passport, can't move anywhere. How about we invite him to become an honorary citizen of Prosech? Then he could become an honorary citizen of the Czech Republic. Then he could travel to the USA, which is where he wanted to go, on a Czech passport. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. My father went to Prague, spoke with President Beneš. Beneš sent him to Switzerland. He met with Thomas Mann and his family. Thomas Mann scholars know this, but very few people know that he actually came to Princeton on a Czech passport. So the Germans were none too pleased with this. And my father learned that when the Germans were marching into Prague on March 15th, 1939, we have to remember, there was no internet, none of that stuff. Word got to him that he should disappear, that he was on the first hit list. So he left Prague. By this time, we had moved to live in Prague from Prosech. And he boarded a train to Berlin. Where else would he go? He decided that nobody would think to look for him there. And on the train, he met a woman in the compartment who had been visiting her grandmother, was taking some milk or cream or something home, and you couldn't take food across borders just as you can't now. The agricultural industry didn't like that. And they got talking. He said, okay, I won't tell you have that stuff there when the guard comes. And they got talking, and he told her, he was leaving for these reasons. And where are you staying? He said he didn't know. And she invited him she said, you can stay in my apartment. And I think that my brother could help you get on the train tomorrow. He told her he was on his way to Britain by whichever train would go across Germany. And later that evening, there was a knock at the door, and she said that would be my brother, and then walked an SS officer. So, right, that's what my father thought. He said, that's it, I'm done. And in fact, that was not the case. this SS officer, whose name was Henry Schreiber, the next morning spirited my father onto the train. That is how he got across Germany and ended up in Brussels. When he arrived in Brussels, which would be the 17th of March by now, he went to get his airline ticket to go to England. He had plenty of money. He knew about greasing people's pockets and all of that. Plenty of check money, and he came to pay for his ticket. And the lady at the airport said, "Sorry, funny money, that you are now, this money is no longer valuable. It can't be used because it's from an enemy-occupied country," because, of course, by now, the Germans had taken over Czechoslovakia. The gentleman behind Rudolph said, "Excuse me, I'm hearing the conversation. Allow me to buy your ticket." And he paid for my father's ticket, and I think gave him some English pounds, and that's how my father got to England. So the stories of how we escaped were all built on that foundation of how people helped and their altruism, because none of those people had anything at all to gain from that.
Wow, what an incredible story. You've spent a lifetime being a voice for survivors for the cause of Holocaust education. I want to wrap up by asking you what you think about Holocaust education as it exists now, almost 75 years since the end of World War II, 78 years almost. And why is it important that voices of people who were witnesses and survivors continue to be heard?
Two quick answers. As far as Holocaust education is concerned today, I absolutely believe it has to come out of the straight history book, you know, page 27 to 29, second semester is the Holocaust. It has to be made relevant to today's generation, and I believe the way to do that is to reframe how it is taught. Certainly, it's important to teach it to honor the many people, the millions lost, the 6 million plus others. But I think it needs to be reframed to demonstrate the power of altruism, and I'll probably repeat myself, the power of one, because of course I have to look at Nicholas Winton, and there's a prime example of the power of one. And I've forgotten what your other question was.
You've partially answered why is it important that,
yes.
that
Why is
survivors
it
be heard?
important for people like me to keep talking about this? Because we're the last authentic witnesses. The deniers cannot discount, you saw in the picture, my visa. They cannot discount the label that was around my neck. And they cannot discount a document that I have, which says, it's on Gestapo newspaper, print, which says we are confiscating the property of Jew Rudolf Fleischmann, date of birth Sonia, date of birth daughter Milena, date of birth Eva, for the benefit of the Third Reich. And that's exactly what happened. I have that document. And I'd like to meet a denier who can argue that point with me. And that's why those of us who can really must continue to talk.
Well, Eva, may you live to 120. Thank you so much. I'd like to invite to the stage Peter Osnos. Peter is on my most admired list and has been a mentor and a guide on this project. Peter and I have something else in common. We were both born in India, as you can doubtless tell by our striking visual resemblance. Seriously, Peter's parents fled Poland for what was then British India before they emigrated to America. Peter's birth certificate lists his caste as Polish, and he certainly has had a high caste career. He was a Washington Post foreign editor, and then the career in publishing, including the founding of PublicAffairs Books, And among its famous authors and fantastic works is our panelist Linda Kinstler's book, Come to This Court and Cry, How the Holocaust Ends. Peter joins me tonight as moderator. Peter.
Well, thank you, Fred, and I must say, when you talk about mentors and you're talking to Fred de San Lazaro and Judy Woodruff, and you're listening to what that we just heard, Eva. I have to say that I wouldn't be here tonight if I didn't have parents who were as intrepid, courageous, and lucky as mine were. They got out, crossed from Poland first to Romania, Turkey, Iraq, eventually to India, where they lived until the very end of 1943, December 26th, when they got on a boat, the USS Hermitage, crossed the Pacific, arrived in San Pedro, California on February 6th. I was in a basket. So the fact of the matter is that their lives and my life were completely different. I just want to say one last thing. I'm wearing a ring that was my father's until he died, and now is mine, and eventually will be one of my offspring. And what is it? I didn't know until we took our grandsons to India. And I finally found somebody there who explained the ring to me. It's a frog on a lily pad. It's the frog on the lily pad is a symbol of safety and security. And it's obvious that my father had this golden ring made when they got to India and were safe. So all of us have, and I'm sure virtually everybody in this room, has some version of that story, or else we wouldn't be here. This is the 75th anniversary of the founding of Israel. It's also one lifetime, which happens to be essentially mine since the Holocaust. This confluence is extraordinary and in some ways vexing, because for much of these last 75 years, the anti-Semitism, which is so symbolic of Jewish history, seemed to have subsided, certainly in this country. It doesn't ever go away, but it certainly was in remission. And now, at this moment, with Israel at 75 and a very complicated political situation there, and the lifetime of the children of Holocaust survivors is what mine is, there's this sense of anti-Semitism beginning to stir itself. And on one hand, you want to say, oh no, it can't possibly be. On the other hand, study history, and underestimating what it can mean is a mistake. Two things very quickly. One, the 20th century was also the century of the genocides. Genocide was a word that was created after the Holocaust. Rwanda, Cambodia, Rohingya, Darfur. But the Holocaust is the Holocaust with a capital H. Not just in numbers, but in some other way. And I think one of the things we want to talk about tonight is to try to understand a bit more of that. And finally, just to show you something that I know that we're talking about Holocaust memory. See, I didn't tell you this, this is a sneaky thing to do. But I've been reading this wonderful little book called Life Sketches, which is John Hersey, the fabulous John Hersey, Hiroshima, and a great many other things. And here's a paragraph that I found in a piece he wrote in December 1974 called Children of the Holocaust. He's quoting a young woman in Israel, the daughter, the child of Holocaust survivors. When I was a little girl, I read books and accepted the Holocaust as a fact. But now I understand why people want to put it out of their minds, and so convince themselves that it won't happen again. I do myself. I want my life. I'm involved with creative dancing. I hope my army training will be near Haifa, so I can go on with my lessons in the same studio there. That's 50 years ago, when Holocaust memory was already a question. So here we are on this year, on this anniversary, and this evening. The purpose of this evening is to see where we're taking Holocaust memory, Holocaust education, allyship, and just the whole extraordinary saga of some of the people who are here with us, Eva. So that's it, Fred. And I'm now supposed to introduce. You're going to have me.
Why don't you start with the first two panelists?
Yes. Fred assigned me to introduce. He said he didn't want to do too much talking, so. I'm going to introduce two of the panelists, and I suppose you want them to come up, right?
I do.
Introduce them?
Oh, we do.
Everybody
does.
We do. Magda, why don't you come on up, and I will introduce you. And I will say in my best Polish, dzień dobry. Magda Teter holds the Shvidler Chair in Judaic Studies here at Fordham, a scholar of early modern history of Jewish history and Jewish-Christian relations, among several other specializations. She is the author of the acclaimed book, Blood Libel, on the Trail of an Anti-Semitic Myth. And you have to read, if you don't read the Rook, which you should read the review in the New York Review of Books, which is unforgettable. And her new book, Christian Supremacy, Reckoning with the Roots of Anti-Semitism and Racism, will soon be released by Princeton University Press. She was born and raised in Cold War Poland. James Leffler, please. James Leffler holds the J. Berkowitz Chair in Jewish Studies at the University of Virginia. The University of Virginia and Fordham. I think that's quite remarkable, really, that those two universities are where we have these Jewish chairs. He's also a prolific author in mainstream media and scholarly work that includes Rooted Cosmopolitan Jews and Human Rights in the 20th Century and The Law of Strangers, Jewish Lawyers and International Law. He has a new one in the pipeline about anti-Semitism and civil rights in post-war America. In a breathtakingly varied career, Jim happens to be a trained pianist and musicologist. Fred.
Welcome, Jim. Linda Kinstler is a journalist and author whose book I just mentioned was described by the Washington Post as an important look at how how Holocaust stories have been passed down and altered. She also brings a compelling biography to this work. Her mother's family was Jewish, but her paternal grandfather served with the Nazi collaborationist unit in Latvia. Oh, yes. She is passionate about the role of Gen 3 descendants in amplifying the voices of Holocaust survivors. Journalism has taken her to Britain for The Atlantic and to Ukraine for the New Republic. She's currently finishing her PhD in rhetoric at the University of California, Berkeley. Linda Kinstler. Judy Woodruff is now a senior correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. That feels to me like introducing the Pope as simply a Jesuit priest. With no disrespect intended toward Jesuit priests, especially in this Jesuit institution. But Judy Woodruff is a towering presence in American journalism, a pioneer whose career over nearly 5 decades has won her every conceivable award, including 25 honorary doctorates, and very recently, a Lifetime Emmy, recognizing her as one of the most trusted voices in America. She's certainly one of my heroes. Judy, thank you. Okay, we'll get down finally to our discussion, and maybe I should take a seat. It's worth noting that just about exactly a year ago, Volodymyr Zelensky, was telling the world, at least publicly, to chill out. The West, he thought, was grossly exaggerating the threat of a Russian invasion. It seemed to so many so implausible, inconceivable in modern Europe, even to Ukraine's president. Less than a month from now, we'll observe 1 year since the start of a war that has killed tens of thousands and displaced millions of people. And yet this war has become just one headline among many on our front and landing pages today, only occasionally leading news broadcasts. Given all this, the question rises, given the snapshot of today, what does it tell us about the shelf life of longer ago events? How do we sustain awareness, accurate history, and lessons from the Holocaust? Anyone, if you can jump in, but I'll start with you, Jim Leffler, because it's my job to be the traffic cop. Take it away.
Thank you. And it's an honor to be here to talk tonight, after especially hearing from Eva and hearing the stories that have shaped this moment, right? So I would start by saying this. There's that line from Faulkner, the past is not past, it's still with us. I've just butchered it, but the idea is, the Holocaust is an event which ripples through history. And even if we think we have a memory of it, there are multiple memories. One of the ways to understand this moment with Ukraine is to say there was a legacy of how the Holocaust ended there with the Soviet Union, with the violence inflicted on that region, tearing apart the fabric of that society, which had deep legacies. And of course, it also led to the preposterous charge of Putin that he was going into, fight Nazism, right, and fight fascists there. So I think there are different memories of the Holocaust. And one of our challenges is to build a frame so we can build an ethical response that takes the memory and brings people back together to understand what it was about and what it wasn't. I think there's something very powerful we heard from Eva, which was, when she was describing her own experience of memories, what she remembered, she also talked about how her memory had been nursed and supplemented by people explaining to her experience, reminding her of things, describing things that had happened to her family and to her when she didn't even remember. And it reminds us that memory it's not just an individual flame that we kind of nurse, right? It's a social endeavor. And one of our challenges, I think, today is to figure out how we can rebuild that frame and how we can make Holocaust memory relevant, but also to build a common understanding of the past. That's one of the things I think we've lost. And you can see that in the war that you began by asking us to think about, and you can see that in the fractious politics about Holocaust memory today, that we seem to be operating almost with completely different sets of memory, that divide us rather than bringing us together.
And if I can just jump in quickly,
Please.
I have done a lot of work on Babin Yar, which is the largest Holocaust mass grave in Eastern Europe and is a site of immense importance for Ukrainian history, for Jewish history in Ukraine. And one of the things that I think about when I think about this war, especially the first days of the war, as I'm sure many people in the audience are well aware of, was that it was the site of Babin Yar which was targeted by a Russian missile in the very first week, which had the effect of damaging severely a long-awaited Holocaust memorial project in which finally historians and artists and academics had all come together trying to find a language to talk about the Holocaust in the 21st century. And now, that project is kind of infinitely delayed.
I will add that I asked that question of my students, how to talk about the Holocaust in the 21st century. And one of the things that they said to me is that we need to talk about what led up to it, not just talk about it, but what led up to it. And that is that makes it relevant because they can see the processes, they can see the mental frameworks, they can see the media environment, the propaganda work that resonates with them and the world that they are living in. And the deep roots that live in it, that it doesn't spring up within 6 years. It doesn't spring up in 1933. This is an outcome of a longer process. So I think we need to recalibrate that story to include that longer story too. Linda's is how the Holocaust ends, but also how it begins, and it doesn't necessarily begin in 1933.
Judy, for stories such as this, and we will have, reportages we do all the time. You introduced a story last year that we just witnessed. Is it a challenge with the competing demands on time to cover stories that are not just timely but timeless in a sense?
Well, there's always competition. First of all, I just want to say what a thrill and an honor it is for me to be here as part of the Undertold Stories project, which I don't think there's anything else like it in the country. And so for me, it's a perfect coming together of this incredibly important subject that we're here to talk about tonight. Making sure we never, ever forget the Holocaust, and also to think of it in terms of a story that, yes, we talk about it, but we can never talk about it enough because of what it says about our humanity. So I just have to pay tribute to the Undertold Stories project, University of St. Thomas, the work you've done for the NewsHour. But yes, there's always competition for time, and so there always has to be, at the NewsHour and at any news organization, a deliberate intention to not to forget, to remember the things that say who we are as human beings, who we are as Americans, who we are as Holocaust survivors, and in every other respect. And I'll just say from a personal standpoint, I was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma. When I was 5 years old, my father was in the military, and he had been assigned to Germany. He was in the Army. My first memory, I had just turned 5 years old, was arriving in Mannheim and seeing towering piles, block after block, of what was left after the war. And of course, I was at that point too young in my family. My parents, my father had been a Methodist and a Baptist, and my mother had been a Baptist, and I wasn't really anything at the time. Neither one of my parents was very much involved in the church, but it would be a while before I would learn about what had happened during the war. But those images are burned in my memory as a young child, seeing that. And so I think we all bring our own personal history, our own personal story to what we're talking about. And just quickly to your question, yes, there are competing claims, but we have to come to every one of these important stories, like the Holocaust, like remembering, with an intention that we won't forget. And so there's always been that intention and determination at the NewsHour, place you know very well since it was first organized by Robert McNeil and Jim Lehrer in 1975. It's been a place where they not only wanted to cover the news, but they always wanted to put it in historical context. And so what better example of that is this?
And I think we'll get into the discussion a little bit later on about the media ecosystem in which we function. What is the future of McNeil-Lehrer journalism at a time when we think it's so essential? But I want to hand off to you, Peter. You had some thoughts as you...
Thank you, Fred. I'm just going to start with Linda. And the reason I'm going to start with Linda is that the books she's written, Come to This Court and Cry, which was the last sentence of the British prosecutor's closing statement in Nuremberg, Hartley Shawcross. I heard about the book, started to read it, and had no idea it was published by the company that I founded. And I said, well, now that. So I needed to, and I was reading the book, and I have to say, it's completely fascinating. It's a very different way of looking at those events from most of the kinds of books that are written about the Holocaust. It's a personal story, but it's also a piece of extraordinary investigative journalism of a kind. So, and one of the other things about, you will take a look at Linda and see she's a little younger than the rest of us. You are the generation born long after the Holocaust. You are so classically an American story, but you really aren't. Because you have done the work on your father or grandfather. It's an amazing story. I tell you, read the book, read all the books, including mine, but read hers first. So Linda, can you explain how you, in the context of your sort of growing up, your education, how this instinct to dig so deeply into something that happened so very long ago before you were born.
Yeah, I will do my best to do so succinctly. But basically, my parents came over to the United States from the Soviet Union, from Riga, Latvia. And I was born in the US. I was the first one born here. I was sent to Jewish day school, had a bat mitzvah. I was taught justice, justice, you shall pursue. And I took it very much to heart. And so what happened was, I became a journalist. I was kind of starting my career. And at the same time, certain archives were opening up in the former Soviet Union, so certain things that had been kind of long kept under cover were coming up and making waves, and there were a lot of rumors and conspiracies circulating. And one of those stories had to do with my paternal grandfather, who in fact was part of the RIS Commando, which was one of the most brutal killing commandos in that region, and who after the war went to work for the KGB in some capacity, which we learned from these archives, which just came out. And then he disappeared. And so that's what I was left with. And the reason I started writing the book, I didn't have a choice, really. I found out that there was a legal proceeding going on in Latvia, not about my grandfather, but about one of his, another man who had worked in the commando, whose name was Herbert Zuckers, who, after the Israeli intelligence service went and kidnapped Adolf Eichmann and spirited him to trial in Israel, one of those same Mossad agents went back and assassinated Zuckers in Uruguay in 1965. And the trial that I found out about, it was a kind of a criminal investigation, what we would think of a pretrial proceeding, was about whether he could have been said to have pulled the trigger, even though by this point he had been dead for 6 decades. And so I found myself a person of interest in this investigation because of my familial ties to it. The prosecutor asked me for evidence, and that set me off on this investigation to understand why this trial is happening. What is it about this kind of desire for a certain kind of truth? Who is on trial here? And what does that do to this kind of inherited memory? And how is it perverting it? So I ended up being very combative against a certain form of denialism that I saw in this trial.
And to this day, the role of individuals in that period needs to be examined. And who did what, how did it happen? And your interest in it is evidence that it's got a very significant hold on it. James, University of Virginia, not a hotbed of Judaic, but I mean, it became, in 2000, was it 16?
17.
17.
Yeah.
I think the first time in recent history that anti-Semitism somehow exploded was on that night in Charlottesville. And it was the, we will not, or whatever it was, we're not. So can you, and you've written about it extensively, can you talk a little bit about that sudden moment when suddenly anti-Semitism, which was in remission, suddenly seemed again so vibrant?
Yeah. Yes, of course. The first thing to say is that it is not just always a question of hate festering and streaming on in a kind of a stream that flows through. Haters find hate, right? And one of the people who was behind that terrible weekend of violence, Richard Spencer, a white supremacist, he's somebody who actually went to the University of Virginia and he studied Nazi history, right? He studied German history. One of the reasons that there were torches there was because he said, oh, I like what they did in Germany, right? And he actually also studied Richard Wagner and said, I want to create spectacle, right? So he was almost borrowing from the playbook, not just feeling a kinship with these horrible moments in history, but saying that's a tool, that's a code we can use. And it was a very difficult moment, I think, for those of us in Charlottesville, but also for America to make sense of this. One of the reasons is that it was many different things rolled into one. You'll recall the people who came there came because of a Confederate statue. And yet they were talking about Jews and using all of this Nazi and Holocaust denial imagery. And one of the challenges, and I think it's still a challenge for American society, is to understand these two different stories colliding. And they collided in Charlottesville, right? There was a recognizable strain of anti-Semitism, a terrifying strain, and then there was color-based racism, right? And a long history of that the university has struggled to reckon with. And we're still struggling to reckon with it because history doesn't allow us to only have one, trauma to process at a time, right? These things collide. And that has been, I think, the challenge for us. All the more so because of what you said, Peter, which is, the past continues to disclose itself as archives open up. That is true over in Eastern Europe, and that is true in this country too, right? My university is one of many that have gone into their own records to say, well, wait, what do we actually know about what enslavement looked like in this physical place, right? So when they went to build the new history building, everybody was excited, we're going to get a new campus building, and then they discovered an African-American cemetery, burial grounds, didn't even know it existed. And then people began to dig deeper, and they began to realize that there's actually a story about eugenics here in Virginia, which connects to people influenced by what's happening in Nazi Germany in the early 20th century, and it's flowing back and forth. So that complexity reveals itself once the archives begin to open up. And that's a role that historians have to play, but of course also journalists and educators.
So let me ask you, what was the sense after this happened, the awareness, for example, in a student body of anti-Semitism, number one, and where's the kind of issue of Israel and Palestinians and Jews at the University of Virginia now?
So that's a complicated topic.
You have 30 seconds.
Okay.
Please, because we do.
I would say
we are limited with time, so yes.
Yeah. Here's what I would say about it. Anti-Semitism today is not all about Israel. It's not all about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? It comes from many different sources in society, but it often ends up there, right? Because that is a very live, very difficult political conflict. There is violence there, right? There is struggle. There is confusion among Americans, I think, what to make sense of it and how to relate to it. So the conversation at my university was immediately about the dangers here, but it was also about, well, what is anti-Semitism? And much of there were arguments about, well, what exactly is it? We know what it's like when we see the Holocaust. We know what it's like over there. But this is surprising to people, Jews and non-Jews, and they're trying to make sense of it because Jews are not the same kind of vulnerable minority that other groups are in the American narrative. So there was a struggle, and I think there is still a struggle to kind of respectfully engage with that and recognize that this is a complex identity of Jews. Just like you heard from Eva, that one could be a Jew in her childhood, and it was not about religion, and yet there was a distinct identity there. So one of the challenges that emerged at my university was not immediately a climate of intense fear for Jews or Jewish students, but a climate of challenge. How do we explain what this is? How do we explain anti-Semitism when it does seem so far away, and yet these people are here, and we don't even know what they're talking about? Jews will not replace us, right? What does that slogan mean?
I wouldn't jump in with, on that note, with Magda, and you've talked about trying to decipher or to identify the building blocks of hate, which is something that you've talked about. And circle back to what we're beginning with. How relevant is all that happened building up to the Holocaust to what we're looking at today? How did we get here today? Talk a little bit more about identifying, diagnosing the hate as it crescendos, if that's the right word.
Judy Woodruff's memory of Germany made me think about a film, a 50-minute documentary film from 1948 by a Jewish filmmaker, Leo Hurwitz, Strange Victory. And it has a phrase, at the beginning at the beginning was the word, and then it was rubble. So it all starts with the word, it still all starts with an idea, and then the process of how those words are transformed and then acted on and disseminated that leads to actions and then ends. The Holocaust shows us where it can end. So I think it's important for us to recognize that, because as the Auschwitz Memorial said, it didn't start with gas chambers. That was the final stage. And that's why there are connections in America, there are connections between anti-Semitism and racism that memory of that connection was broken. In fact, that film is about that connection, that 1948 film. It was broken in the 60s, and it's now coming back. And the other thing that is important to realize, and this is something that Jim alluded to, is that there's no direct lineage. These are moments where that reservoir of knowledge of hate is then drawn upon in specific historic moments. And what we're seeing in the United States now, and this is what really troubles me, is that there is not so much Holocaust denialism, but it's that glorification of Nazi Germany. It's that glorification, in fact, therefore also of what they did. And that is coming from the source, the sort of the cauldron of Nazi propaganda, which itself draws on the sources of my expertise, medieval, early modern sources that were then packaged to justify what was done to Jews. And what these people, like Richard Spencer and others, they study this and then they deploy it in this moment. It's not that it was, direct line from 1930s to Charlottesville, Virginia, but it's that moment. So we need to understand and unpack why this kind of information, this kind of knowledge is deployed and used and then instrumentalized for hate in these histories.
We profess, I think, universally in America to worship the First Amendment and our freedom of expression. But we've seen so much change in our media ecosystem, Judy, where things that were uttered along the margins are now mainstream. There are utterances that were extreme at one point that are now being uttered by people who have real power. And I just wonder, how difficult is it to be a classic journalist in this day and age when you have so much coming at you from people who are powerful and therefore matter, and talk a little bit about how you deal with, frankly, lies today.
Well, it's a big subject, as you know very, very well from your massive reporting experience. I was trained, I'll just say, as you said, somebody said over 50 years ago, to be, that a reporter, I was told and trained and taught, that a reporter is someone who goes and gathers the facts and then reports them back. And you listen to all sides, you try to be fair, you don't take sides, you report. That's what it's all about. In fact, my first producer said to me, nobody gives a damn what Judy Woodruff thinks. We want you to go out and gather the information, make sure it's confirmed, it's accurate, and then we want to share it with our audience. But of course that's a basic tenet of journalism. But of course we are in a fraught and frightening in many ways political period right now. Our country is divided as it's ever been, which we may want to talk about later. It's one of the things I'm working on right now, trying to understand. But into that sort of old-fashioned concept of journalism has come within the last decade and longer, a rising animosity in our politics. The fact that people don't just disagree now on the issues, they disagree on fundamental questions of our culture, of our identity, who we are, what we fundamentally believe, whether it's our religious faith, whether it's our racial background, our ethnic background. All of these things have now come into the mix. And you have a willingness on the part of many of our political leaders to use very strong and graphic language, negative language, characterizing and humiliating people with that language. And so we in the press, you know, and we're not a monolith, we're all different, have had to come up with sort of a new construct, if you will. I mean, how do you both cover the news, be fair, cover it all, and call out something that is not the truth, that is a lie? And I will tell you flat out, I've had difficulty with that because I was taught to understand that a lie, you have to know what's in someone's heart and their mind to label it a lie. So at the NewsHour, we've moved into this realm. We now call out information that is not factually based, that has not been confirmed, and we say that's not the facts. It just isn't that way. We've used the word lie more carefully because that does suggest that we know what is in someone's heart and mind. That's not the easiest thing to know. In fact, I would say it's very difficult to know. But we are in a new place as journalists, and we have to take our role very seriously. I'd say we've done that all along. But today in particular, when a lot of information is being thrown around, the news, as you suggested, it's not just a few newspapers and a few broadcast networks. It's online, it's coming in from everywhere, it's not vetted, there's social media, people are putting information out there that has no basis in fact, and then there's information that has been vetted. So there's much greater, I'll just say this finally, there's a much larger burden placed on all of you who are news consumers to figure out, okay, can I trust this? Can I believe this versus can I trust that? How do I know what to believe? We are in a much more complex and complicated moment when it comes to understanding and figuring out what to expect. So it's a big, big topic.
You know, Judy, when you say that we all have this responsibility, what I say is that we've all become editors-in-chief. We choose what we want. We curate what we want, where we're going to get it, how much of it. And that's a phenomenon just of the modern era. We were not editors-in-chief when we all picked up the New York Times or watched NBC. Now we can do all of that, and that's a significant change.
You mean PBS?
Magda, I want to ask you a Holocaust question. But there is a Holocaust. But, I've been to Auschwitz 3 times. Just recently and just before the pandemic. And for the first time I found the scrolls, you know, with names. And I have to say, to my astonishment, I found 19 names that are the same last name as mine. That had not happened to me before. It was kind of a revelation. But then, after our walking around, we had lunch at the Auschwitz Cafe. There were tour groups. And in Poland now, the remnants, the chief in Krakow, a rabbi who came from Brooklyn, has a waiting list of people who want to come on Friday night to the... And one of the questions I have is, the Holocaust did what it did. No question. But did the Holocaust truly destroy the history of Jews in Poland?
Wow, that's a whole course I'm teaching this semester, Eastern European Jewish history.
Well, you know, in the sense that, because what we're all trying to understand is memory.
Yeah.
And the memory of the Jews in Poland now, and there are Jews in Poland now, how do we understand the degree to which history was eliminated?
So I think one of the ways that the Holocaust and the murder of Jews in Eastern Europe has resulted in, that it allowed in the post-war Poland, for complex political and cultural reasons, to imagine Polish identity as an ethnic identity, as Poland for Poles. What was a pre-war position of right-wing ethno-nationalists that was counteracted by a vision of Poland as a multi-ethnic Poland. The Holocaust created a cultural, political, and social phenomenon where there were no other groups except for ethnic Poles. So Poland was for Poles alone. And what we're seeing now with the revival of Jewish life, with the voices of trying to remember that multi-ethnic Polish history that stretches back centuries, that this has been politicized, and that version of the multi-ethnic Polish history is offering a political vision that is clashing with some of the vision of some generally the ruling party, but also large groups within Polish society that again come from both the anti-communist roots, but also were fed by the communist erasure of the Jewish past and the Jewish experience and the murder of Jews during World War II.
So let me ask you a classic Jewish question. Is what's happening in Poland now good for the Jews? What do you think about this connection between modern Poland and the Holocaust and the diaspora? How do we all relate to each other?
Well, I'm not sure I get the question, but I think one of the efforts, and I think this is the broader way of addressing hate, is to imagine and remember that shared past. That we share roots, we share culture, that nobody lived in silos, that Jewish history is Polish history, and that Polish history is Jewish history. I asked the question, how Jewish is Polish history, for instance? And the same question can be asked here, and is in fact being asked in the United States about the shared past. So I would say that one way of counteracting hate, of remembering the Holocaust, of remembering it's thinking about that shared history, that shared past, and in terms of Poland, about what some Polish Jews who live there, about Polish Jews. That is that they are part of Poland and they are Polish.
I'm going to jump in now because as broadcasters, we're probably the most time sensitive and we don't have a lot. I wanted to say if we have questions, to please bring them up or put them.
Are we ready for questions now?
Well, we'll get to it. I want to very quickly talk about a couple of themes that we saw in this video, and that's about allyship and where we are in America today. We've seen alliances, the Black-Jewish alliance through the civil rights era, for example. There was a parallel to it of sorts in South Africa during the apartheid years. And then there's another kind of alliance, which is an alliance between or an alliance with people who are not the targets of extremism and hate. So the question to the panel is, how do you sustain alliances, both the natural ones that come from common cause, Jews and blacks, and alliances with groups and people who are not the direct targets of hate, not only engaging them, but sustaining a relationship, dealing with what's commonly called fatigue on these issues. People get fatigued. People say that Ukraine has receded from the headline due to fatigue. So the question is, how do you sustain alliances and allyship?
So maybe I'll jump in on that. Sure. I think one of the things you learn when you teach these days in the college campus is that the best asset we have as humans is our imagination. So it's not just our interests, and our allyship and alliances built on common experience even, but our capacity to imagine, right? And I think we heard some about this. Imagine what it's like for a young child, but also to be curious about others and experiences. So just as you heard Magda describe in Contemporary Poland, there are Poles, including young Polish scholars, who say, we imagine that, we remember that past, we imagine this commonality, and that allows us to work, to say, we want to reckon with Poland's past, but we also want to, understand this as Poland doesn't have to be the way it is today, right? And I think in this country, one of the powerful things I see is when you have people come into the classroom, they don't have a connection to the Holocaust, they don't have a connection to Jewish history necessarily, but they're curious about it because they want to understand refugees, they want to understand wars today. So using that imagination is one way you can do it. The imagination can cut both ways, because as we heard Magda describe, and Peter alluded to, in Poland today, they've criminalized the study of the Holocaust. And they imagine Jews as this worldwide conspiracy that wants to somehow, circumscribe and hurt Polish history. That's why we have colleagues and friends who have been sued and taken to court in Poland for writing about the Holocaust. So they imagine Jews as still an enemy, but there are many other Poles who imagine Jews as a partner and in a dialogue about it. So in this country, we have to find ways to do that too. The hard thing, I would say, is that we're in a culture where even for journalists, I think because of the internet and media, that our attention spans have been shrunk and we have less and less time to do that. And imaginations take time. You have to be able to kind of get into the backstory of people, right, and luxuriate in it. So I think we have to find ways to do that. Otherwise, it's always going to be, are we the same or are we not the same, right?
Yeah, I would say that it depends. I think the key way to approach it is to broaden the definition of the word we. Who do you think we are? How do we define who we are? And if we're only defining it as we, our narrow sort of identities, then it might be difficult to find allies. But if we broaden the we to that shared history that I've then we might be able to find those connections in this way. And the other thing that I am working on, anti-Semitism and racism, and in the exhibit that the provost mentioned, we explored the resistance to hate. That resistance comes from mostly the communities that were affected by that. The voices of allies are there, but very fewer than we would like. We imagine ourselves as being, we would be the just ones. We may not be the ones. But amplifying those voices is important, and that's what may give us tools of how we might be allies, how we might pay for that ticket for the next person who might be behind us. So those stories are important in that way, that are giving us ways to think about those.
In the very limited time that we have left, I want to bring everybody in, and we've got a pile of questions which we doubtless will not get through. But I'm going to take another 10 minutes if that's okay. But I want to get to the issue of Holocaust education, which is now mandatory, I think, forever in 27 states. Only 27 states mandated, for example. And Linda, you've talked about having some reservations about the way in which it's taught. Can you expand a little bit? There's a question that I'll just fold in from the audience. It says, are you concerned that some school systems won't teach the Holocaust because it, quote, is uncomfortable for children?
Yeah, certainly. Well, I'm sure many people in the audience also saw that the Claims Commission came out with a report today or yesterday that said that a quarter of Dutch Gen Z students thought that the Holocaust was exaggerated. Which, to come out of the Netherlands, the home of the Anne Frank Museum, tells us something perhaps. And I think that, we're talking about how to speak about the Holocaust. I think that we just haven't found the right language to speak about it at this very fraught moment, which we knew has been coming for a long time, this moment when it passes out of memory and into history. And that's a very fragile place to be. What do we do with the testimonies that we have collected? How do we present them? this is why we see all the debates about, the holograms of survivors telling their stories, or, something that would literally confront someone walking down the path of Babin Yar and speak to them, out of the grass. And I don't know what the right approach is. I can say that I don't think the right approach is the forensic one, where we try to nail down exactly who betrayed whom, who did what at what minute, because that is a quick way of putting yourself on the perpetrator's footing, I would say, to say that you are even giving credence to some kind of questioning of this. I think that we see that all too often, and I'm sure many people have read about what happened with the so-called cold case investigation into Anne Frank, and so I don't need to explain that anymore. But I think if we move away from that, because what that does, it doesn't broaden it to who we are. It minimizes it very, very quickly and allows for all kinds of denialism to take root.
Yeah, I would add that we should probably move away from the framing of the Holocaust as unique. That has been used often as in Holocaust education or in Holocaust thinking, and unique and inexplicable. And it was done for fear that explaining the Holocaust will serve as a justification for what happened. Explanation is not justification, but thinking about it as unprecedented at the time, and that therefore, and also as Yehuda Bauer has argued, as a human event, and therefore both explicable but also replicable, is, I think, important.
Magda, what's the difference between Holocaust, capital H, and genocide?
Which ties into some of the questions from
Cambodia, Rwanda, Darfur. What is the difference between Holocaust and capital H?
Just one sentence?
Well, there is a sentence. You tell us the sentence. If not, I'll provoke you.
No, I think the goal of total annihilation of a whole people, rather than a political genocide of removal in land or something like that, that might be in this. But let's not go into it. I think we have lots of questions, and we can have the conversation. But the end goal is different in these different genocides than in that one. Yeah.
I think relevant to it is the whole notion of walling off the Holocaust versus making it a teachable moment. And maybe that's not a teachable moment, a teachable event. And maybe it's not quite that binary, but can you talk a little bit about what distinguishes the Holocaust from everything that came after it? We're talking about walling off the Holocaust, my apologies, versus using it to teach about hate and genocide. Who wants to
I'll just say something quick about that. I mean, I do think it's a real challenge, because we've seen places, you've heard us talk a lot about Eastern Europe, where it gets minimized, and it's said, well, this is just like another genocide, and Stalin committed many genocides, right? And obviously there are atrocities after. On the other hand, the only way we can make it relevant to moral education and to the study of history is to explain, I think as Magda is suggesting, that it can't be removed from history. And therefore, if we want to show what is distinctive about it, we're going to have to compare. And that will allow us to say, well, this is a different scale, or this happened in a type of society that seemed to have built itself up around notions of civilization and prided itself on being, the vanguard of modernity, and yet turn that around to say we now have to, attack our minority. Those types of questions. And then we can ask, what features does it share with other mass atrocities, and how is it different? It's very hard, because I think many of us feel, understandably, both as educators and scholars, when you teach something as historians, you say, we want to make sure you take it on its own terms. It's not the same as this, right? We leave that to the political scientists, right? No offense, who want to say this is a model. But we want to be specific, and we want to honor the specificity of human history. But we have to also step back and relate it to other things, because just like a journalist who has to say what that story means for today, how it can relate, or just like the author of a book who wants to explain what this can mean, we have to make it relevant. So that's our challenge, is to hold it in its very specific, unique status, but also to explain how it is related to other crimes and other challenges in history.
Okay. You know, I think we have about 6 minutes left, and that's going over time in many ways, and my apologies in advance to people who've sent questions in, because we won't get to a lot of them. I'll try to get to a couple, and then we'll do a wrap-up. How to tackle anti-Semitism disguised as anti-Zionism and pro-Palestinian arguments.
Say that louder, Fred.
How to tackle anti-Semitism disguised as anti-Zionism and pro-Palestine arguments. Who wants to take that?
I'll say what I do in my classroom. First, I explain what Zionism is. Students don't know what Zionism is and the history of that. And then we analyze the difference in terms of what is a criticism of a state and a policy versus the tropes that might be used that are actually rooted in frames of thinking that are anti-Semitic in history and roots. And then we actually do, you know, I show them cartoons and is this anti-Semitic or is it a critique of Israeli policies? And unpacking these kinds of things. So I think, but what is depressing about this whole problem is that these memes spread like wildfire through social media, and this kind of work is a retail, slow work of unpacking and making students understand the history and the complexity of various ideas.
Yeah, I would add, I mean, you can't understand that debate unless you look at the history of the Cold War. And you look at how this debate played out. It's not a new phenomenon, and it's not only about Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? It's about the Soviet Union, and it's about colonialism and imperialism.
British history.
British history, and some of the things that you've heard Magda refer to, some of the images and the tropes, right? They emerge from the Soviet lexicon, right? So we have to become historians of language too, right? And historians of visual culture. Visual culture, yeah. I think that can help us. You know, there are some people who will say, well, what does that matter? Because this is happening now, people are experiencing it. But if there's a virtue to the university, it has to be sometimes slow thinking, right? And then we have to be able to unpack it. It won't solve every question, but hopefully it will allow us and our students to begin to think critically about this and to separate value propositions from, you know, just memes.
James, how will you mark the 75th anniversary of Israel at the University of Virginia this year?
Well, I won't be the only one to do it, and I don't think telling the story of Israel belongs only to, you know, the Jewish Studies program, for instance. I think it's part of the story of the Middle East. I think it's part of the story of international affairs.
British history.
And it's part of British history and American history. I don't know, you know, there are different ways to mark it. I think history has to be written in the present, and just as you said, you know, so many things have changed. We have to recognize it in light of the very critical moment of conflict that's happening now, right? It's not just about a debate about where we want justice to come from or how we want peace to happen. It has to be, in some cases, measuring the gap between what people envisioned was possible at that moment in 1948, what it meant, and seeing the different debates inside Israeli society and Palestinian society about what it is and what it isn't. So I think that has to be what we do. Otherwise, we're only looking backwards. And, you know, it has to be understanding how we've moved forwards in order to have a vision of the future. So for the specifics, you can go to our website and see what we do.
And again, with apologies to all of you who wrote questions, you'll have an opportunity perhaps to address them at the reception that follows. But I want to wrap up very, very quickly. And Judy, you have the luxury at the end of your anchoring work to now sit back and reflect on where we are in America today. And that's essentially your next chapter. And I wonder, I'm sure there's a lot of curiosity in this group and online about the preamble of what you're about to embark on. You don't know a lot about it yet. Can you talk a little bit about your new work life?
Well, thank you very much. And again, I just have to say what an honor it is to be here with all of you who have done so much important work on the subject that we're addressing tonight. And again, Fred, the work you've done. I'll just say very briefly that As I did wrap up anchoring at the end of 2022, I had long increasingly thought about how divided we are as a country. And so much of what we're talking about tonight, I think, is a part of that. Americans today, I mean, we've had certainly divided moments in our history, the Civil War, the McCarthy Red Scare era, certainly the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War. There have been plenty of things that we've argued over and fought over. But we seem to be now in a moment of division that has become more personal, where families can't even sit around the table and have Thanksgiving together at times without making it either very uncomfortable or much worse. There's something that has happened to us. We are more polarized than we've been in a long time. Partisanship has just become fiercer. The partisanship is farther apart. And I frankly just want to understand why that is. So I'm planning to spend the next 2 years traveling around the country, talking to ordinary Americans in the middle of the country as well as on the coast, trying to understand how they see our country right now, how they see their role as citizens, why they think we've become as divided as we are, how they're experiencing that, and if they think we can come back together, or how they think we can come back together again. Do they think we should come back together again, or should we be holding fiercely to our opinions? So a lot of questions, and I plan to also talk to scholars and folks who spend a lot of time reading and writing about this, writing books, writing articles, because it turns out there's a lot of scholarship in this era of partisanship. So I'm excited about the project. I think it's something that is worth our doing. I can't say that at the end of the 2 years we're going to understand any better how we've come to be where we are, but I think it's worth exploring, and I very much look forward to talking to people like all of you who are here tonight to try to understand what's come between us, if you will.
One of the things that sticks with me is an interview I did with Archbishop Desmond Tutu in 2010. South Africa was going through a lot of turmoil, it still is, and I asked whether he was optimistic about the future of a country that had seen so much upheaval after apartheid had ended. And he said, "I am not an optimist, I am a prisoner of hope." And that has stuck with me ever since, and I think that's a note that we might wrap tonight up on. And with that, and we're into overtime, thank you, Peter. Much obliged. And thank you, panel. And I want to call Dennis for some closing remarks.
So on behalf of all of us, I want to thank our esteemed panel here for really helping us reflect on the Holocaust in new ways and challenging us to think about what the power of one is for each of us here tonight. I want to thank Fred and Peter for helping to facilitate the conversation. And Eva, thank you for sharing your story with us as well.